This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Graham Williams. Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray, Chapter 45, Between Hampshire and London. Sir Pitt Crawley had done more than repair fences and restore dilapidated lodges on the Queen's Crawley estate. Like a wise man, he had set to work to rebuild the injured popularity of his house and stop up the gaps and ruins in which his name had been left by his disreputable and thriftless old predecessor. He was elected for the borough speedily after his father's demise, a magistrate, a member of Parliament, a county magnate, and representative of an ancient family. He made it his duty to show himself before the Hampshire public, subscribed handsomely to the county charities, called assiduously upon all the county folk, and laid himself out, in a word, to take that position in Hampshire, and in the Empire afterwards, to which he thought his prodigious talents justly entitled him. Lady Jane was instructed to be friendly with the Fuddlestons and the Wapshots and the other famous baronets, their neighbours. Their carriages might frequently be seen in the Queen's Crawley Avenue now. They dined pretty frequently at the Hall, where the cookery was so good that it was clear Lady Jane very seldom had a hand in it, and in return Pitt and his wife most energetically dined out in all sorts of weather and at all sorts of distances. For though Pitt did not care for joviality, being a frigid man of poor health and appetite, yet he considered that to be hospitable and condescending was quite incumbent on his station, and every time that he got a headache from too long and after-dinner sitting, he felt that he was a martyr to duty. He talked about crops, corn laws, politics with the best country gentlemen. He, who had been formerly inclined to be a sad free thinker on these points, entered into poaching and game preserving with ardour. He didn't hunt. He wasn't a hunting man. He was a man of books and peaceful habits, but he thought that the breed of horses must be kept up in the country, and that the breed of foxes must therefore be looked to. And for his part, if his friend Sir Huddleston Fuddleston liked to draw his country, and meet, as of old, the Fuddleston hounds used to do at Queen's Crawley, he should be happy to see him there, and the gentlemen of the Fuddleston hunt. And to Lady Southdown's dismay, too, he became more orthodox in his tendencies every day, gave up preaching in public and attending meeting-houses, went stoutly to church, called on the bishop and all the clergy at Winchester, and made no objection when the venerable Archdeacon Trumper asked for a game of whist. What pangs must have been those of Lady Southdown, and what an utter castaway she must have thought her son-in-law for permitting such a godless diversion. And when, on the return of the family from an oratorio at Winchester, the baronet announced to the young ladies that he should next year very probably take them to the county balls, they worshipped him for his kindness. Lady Jane was only too obedient, and perhaps glad herself to go. The Dowager wrote off the direst descriptions of her daughter's worldly behaviour to the authoress of The Washerwoman of Finchley Common at the Cape, and her house in Brighton being about this time unoccupied, returned to that watering place, her absence being not very much deplored by her children. We may suppose, too, that Rebecca, on paying a second visit to Queen's Crawley, did not feel particularly grieved at the absence of the lady of the medicine chest, though she wrote a Christmas letter to her ladyship, in which she respectfully recalled herself to Lady Southdown's recollection, spoke with gratitude of the delight which her ladyship's conversation had given her on the former visit, dilated on the kindness with which her ladyship had treated her in sickness, and declared that everything at Queen's Crawley reminded her of her absent friend. A great part of the altered demeanour and popularity of Sir Pitt Crawley might have been traced to the counsels of that astute little lady of Curzon Street. "You remain a baronet. You consent to be a mere country gentleman," she said to him, while he had been her guest in London. "No, Sir Pitt Crawley, I know you better. I know your talents and your ambition. You fancy you hide them both, but you can conceal neither from me. I showed Lord Steyne your pamphlet on malt. He was familiar with it, and said it was in the opinion of the whole cabinet the most masterly thing that had appeared on the subject. The ministry has its eye upon you, and I know what you want. You want to distinguish yourself in Parliament. Everyone says you are the finest speaker in England, for your speeches at Oxford are still remembered. You want to be member for the county, where, with your own vote and your borough at your back, you can command anything, and you want to be Baron Crawley of Queen's Crawley, and will be before you die. I saw it all. I could read your heart, Sir Pitt. If I had a husband who possessed your intellect, as he does your name, I sometimes think I should not be unworthy of him. But I am your kinswoman now," she added with a laugh. "Poor little penniless I have got a little interest, and who knows? Perhaps the mouse may be able to aid the lion." Pitt Crawley was amazed and enraptured with her speech. "How that woman comprehends me," he said. "I never could get Jane to read 3 pages of the malt pamphlet. She has no idea that I have commanding talents or secret ambition. So they remember my speaking at Oxford, do they, the rascals? Now that I represent my borough and may sit for the county, they begin to recollect me. Why, Lord Steyne cut me at the levee last year. They are beginning to find out that Pitt Crawley is someone at last. Yes, the man was always the same whom these people neglected. It was only the opportunity that was wanting. And I will show them now that I can speak and act as well as write. Achilles did not declare himself until they gave him the sword. I hold it now, and the world shall yet hear of Pitt Crawley." Therefore it was that this roguish diplomatist has grown so hospitable, that he was so civil to oratorios and hospitals, so kind to deans and chapters, so generous in giving and accepting dinners, so uncommonly gracious to farmers on market days, and so much interested about county business, and that the Christmas at the Hall was the gayest which had been known there for many a long day. On Christmas Day a great family gathering took place. All the Crawleys from the rectory came to dine. Rebecca was as frank and fond of Mrs. Bute as if the other had never been her enemy. She was affectionately interested in the dear girls, and surprised at the progress which they had made in music since her time, and insisted upon encoring one of the duets out of the great songbooks which Jim, grumbling, had been forced to bring under his arm from the rectory. Mrs. Bute, perforce, was obliged to adopt a decent demeanour towards the little adventuress, of course being free to discourse with her daughters afterwards about the absurd respect with which Sir Pitt treated his sister-in-law. But Jim, who had sat next to her at dinner, declared she was a trump, and one and all of the rector's family agreed that the Little Rawdon was a fine boy. They respected a possible baronet in the boy, between whom and the title there was only the little sickly pale Pitt Binkie. The children were very good friends. Pitt Binkie was too little a dog for such a big dog as Rawdon to play with, and Matilda, being only a girl, of course not fit companion for a young gentleman who was near 8 years old and going into jackets very soon. He took the command of this small party at once, the little girl and the little boy following him about with great reverence at such times as he condescended to sport with them. His happiness and pleasure in the country were extreme. The kitchen garden pleased him hugely, the flowers moderately, but the pigeons and the poultry and the stables, when he was allowed to visit them, were delightful objects to him. He resisted being kissed by the Misses Crawley, but he allowed Lady Jane sometimes to embrace him, and it was by her side that he liked to sit, when, the signal to retire to the drawing-room being given, the ladies left the gentlemen to their claret, by her side rather than by his mother. For Rebecca, seeing that tenderness was the fashion, called Rawdon to her one evening, and stooped down and kissed him in the presence of all the ladies. He looked her full in the face after the operation, trembling and turning very red, as his wont was when moved. "You never kiss me at home, mamma," he said, at which there was a general silence and consternation, and a by no means pleasant look in Becky's eyes. Rawdon was fond of his sister-in-law for her regard for his son. Lady Jane and Becky did not get on quite so well at this visit as on occasion of the former one, when the Colonel's wife was bent upon pleasing. Those two speeches of the child struck rather a chill. Perhaps Sir Pitt was rather too attentive to her. But Rawdon, as became his age and size, was fonder of the society of the men than of the women, and never wearied of accompanying his sire to the stables, whither the Colonel retired to smoke his cigar, Jim, the rector's son, sometimes joining his cousin in that and other amusements. He and the baronet's keeper were very close friends, their mutual taste for dogs bringing them much together. On one day Mr. James, the Colonel, and Horn, the keeper, went and shot pheasants, taking little Rawdon with them. On another most blissful morning, these four gentlemen partook of the amusement of rat-hunting in a barn, than which sport Rawdon as yet had never seen anything more noble. They stopped up the ends of certain drains in the barn, into the other openings of which ferrets were inserted, and then stood silently aloof, with uplifted stakes in their hands, and an anxious little terrier, Mr. James's celebrated dog, Forceps, indeed, scarcely breathing from excitement, listening motionless on 3 legs to the faint squeaking of the rats below. Desperately bold at last, the persecuted animals bolted above ground. The terrier accounted for one, the keeper for another. Rawdon, from flurry and excitement, missed his rat, but on the other hand he half murdered a ferret. But the greatest day of all was that on which Sir Huddleston Fuddleston's hounds met upon the lawn at Queen's Crawley. That was a famous sight for little Rawdon. At 10:30, Tom Moody, Sir Huddleston Fuddleston's huntsman, was seen trotting up the avenue, followed by the noble pack of hounds in a compact body, the rear being brought up by the 2 whips, clad in stained scarlet frocks, light, hard-featured lads on well-bred lean horses, possessing marvellous dexterity in casting the points of their long heavy whips at the thinnest part of any dog's skin who dares to straggle from the main body, or to take the slightest notice, or even so much as wink at the hares and rabbits starting under their noses. Next comes Boy Jack, Tom Moody's son, who weighs 5 stone, measures 48 inches, and will never be any bigger. He's perched on a large, raw-boned hunter, half covered by a capacious saddle. This animal is Sir Huddleston Fuddleston's favourite horse, the Knob. Other horses, ridden by other small boys, arrive from time to time, awaiting their masters, who will come cantering on anon. Tom Moody rides up to the door of the hall, where he is welcomed by the butler, who offers him drink, which he declines. He and his pack then draw off into a sheltered corner of the lawn, where the dogs roll on the grass and play or growl angrily at one another, ever and anon breaking out into furious fight, speedily to be quelled by Tom's voice, unmatched at rating, or the snaky thongs of the whips. Many young gentlemen canter up on thoroughbred hacks, spatterdashed to the knee, and enter the house to drink cherry brandy and pay their respects to the ladies, or, more modest and sportsmanlike, divest themselves of their mud boots, exchange their hacks for their hunters, and warm their blood by a preliminary gallop round the lawn. Then they collect round the pack in the corner, and talk with Tom Moody of past sport, and the merits of Sniveller and Diamond, and of the state of the country, and of the wretched breed of foxes. Sir Huddleston presently appears, mounted on a clever cob, and rides up to the hall, where he enters and does the civil thing by the ladies, after which, being a man of few words, he proceeds to business. The hounds are drawn up to the hall door, and Little Rawdon descends among them, excited, yet half alarmed, by the caresses which they bestow upon him, at the thumps he receives from their waving tails, and at their canine bickerings, scarcely restrained by Tom Moody's tongue and lash. Meanwhile Sir Huddleston has hoisted himself unwieldily on the knob. "Let's try Souster's spinney, Tom," says the baronet. "Farmer Mangle tells me there are 2 foxes in it." Tom blows his horn and trots off, followed by the pack, by the whips, by the young gents from Winchester, by the farmers of the neighbourhood, by the labourers of the parish on foot, with whom the day is a great holiday, Sir Huddleston bringing up the rear with Colonel Crawley, and the whole cortege disappears down the avenue. The Reverend Bute Crawley, who has been too modest to appear at the public meet before his nephew's windows, and whom Tom Moody remembers 40 years back, a slender divine riding the wildest horses, jumping the widest brooks, and larking over the newest gates in the country, his reverence, we say, happens to trot out from the rectory lane on his powerful black horse. Just as Sir Huddleston passes, he joins the worthy baronet. Hounds and horsemen disappear, and Little Rawdon remains on the doorsteps, wondering and happy. During the progress of this memorable holiday, Little Rawdon, if he had got no special liking for his uncle, always awful and cold, and locked up in his study, plunged in justice business, and surrounded by bailiffs and farmers, has gained the good graces of his married and maiden aunts, of the 2 little folks of the hall, and of Jim of the rectory, whom Sir Pitt is encouraging to pay his addresses to one of the young ladies, with an understanding, doubtless, that he shall be presented to the living when it shall be vacated by his fox-hunting old sire. Jim has given up that sport himself, and confines himself to a little harmless duck or snipe shooting, or a little quiet trifling with the rats during the Christmas holidays, after which he will return to the university and try not to be plucked once more. He has already eschewed green coats, red neckcloths, and other worldly ornaments, and is preparing himself for a change in his condition. In this cheap and thrifty way, Sir Pitt tries to pay off his debt to his family. Also, before this merry Christmas was over, the baronet had screwed up courage enough to give his brother another draft on his bankers, and for no less a sum than £100, an act which caused Sir Pitt cruel pangs at first, but which made him glow afterwards to think himself one of the most generous of men. Rawdon and his son went away with the utmost heaviness of heart. Becky and the ladies parted with some alacrity, however, and our friend returned to London to commence those avocations with which we find her occupied when this chapter begins. Under her care, the Crawley house in Great Gaunt Street was quite rejuvenescent, and ready for the reception of Sir Pitt and his family when the baronet came to London to attend his duties in Parliament, and to assume that position in the country for which his vast genius fitted him. For the first session, this profound dissembler hid his projects, and never opened his lips, but to present a petition from Mudbury. But he attended assiduously in his place, and learned thoroughly the routine and business of the house. At home he gave himself up to the perusal of blue books, to the alarm and wonder of Lady Jane, who thought he was killing himself by late hours and intense application. And he made acquaintance with the ministers and the chiefs of his party, determining to rank as one of them before many years were over. Lady Jane's sweetness and kindness had inspired Rebecca with such a contempt for her ladyship as the little woman found no small difficulty in concealing. That sort of goodness and simplicity which Lady Jane possessed annoyed our friend Becky, and it was impossible for her at times not to show or to let the other divine her scorn. Her presence too rendered Lady Jane uneasy. Her husband talked constantly with Becky. Signs of intelligence seemed to pass between them, and Pitt spoke with her on subjects on which he never thought of discoursing with Lady Jane. The latter did not understand them, to be sure, but it was mortifying to remain silent, still more mortifying to know that you had nothing to say, and hear that little audacious Mrs. Rawdon dashing on from subject to subject, with a word for every man, and a joke always pat, and to sit in one's own house alone by the fireside, and watching all the men round your rival. In the country, when Lady Jane was telling stories to the children, who clustered about her knees, Little Rawdon, into the bargain, who was very fond of her, and Becky came into the room sneering with green, scornful eyes, poor Lady Jane grew silent under those baleful glances. Her simple little fancies shrank away tremulously, as fairies in the story-books before a superior bad angel. She could not go on, although Rebecca, with the smallest inflection of sarcasm in her voice, besought her to continue that charming story. And on her side, gentle thoughts and simple pleasures were odious to Mrs. Becky. They discorded with her. She hated people for liking them. She spurned children and children-lovers. "I have no taste for bread and butter," she would say, when caricaturing Lady Jane and her ways, to my Lord Steyne. "No more has a certain person for holy water," his lordship replied, with a bow and a grin and a great jarring laugh afterwards. So these two ladies did not see much of each other, except upon those occasions when the younger brother's wife, having an object to gain from the other, frequented her. They my loved and my deared each other assiduously, but kept apart generally, whereas Sir Pitt, in the midst of his multiplied avocations, found daily time to see his sister-in-law. On the occasion of his first speaker's dinner, Sir Pitt took the opportunity of appearing before his sister-in-law in his uniform, that old diplomatic suit which he had worn when attaché to the Pumpernickel legation. Becky complimented him upon that dress, and admired him almost as much as his own wife and children, to whom he displayed himself before he set out. She said that it was only the thoroughbred gentleman who could wear the court suit with advantage. It was only your men of ancient race whom the culotte courte became. Pitt looked down with complacency at his legs, which had not, in truth, much more symmetry or swell than the lean court sword which dangled by his side, looked down at his legs, and thought in his heart that he was killing. When he was gone, Mrs. Becky made a caricature of his figure, which she showed to Lord Steyne when he arrived. His lordship carried off the sketch, delighted with the accuracy of the resemblance. He had done Sir Pitt Crawley the honour to meet him at Mrs. Becky's house, and had been most gracious to the new baronet and member. Pitt was struck, too, by the deference with which the great peer treated his sister-in-law, by her ease and sprightliness in the conversation, and by the delight with which the other men of the party listened to her talk. Lord Steyne made no doubt but that the baronet had only commenced his career in public life, and expected rather anxiously to hear him as an orator. As they were neighbours, for Great Gaunt Street leads into Gaunt Square, whereof Gaunt House, as everybody knows, forms one side, my lord hoped that as soon as Lady Steyne arrived in London, she would have the honour of making the acquaintance of Lady Crawley. He left a card upon his neighbour in the course of a day or two, having never thought fit to notice the predecessor, though they had lived near each other for near a century past. In the midst of these intrigues and fine parties, and wise and brilliant personages, Rawdon felt himself more and more isolated every day. He was allowed to go to the club more, to dine abroad with bachelor friends, to come and go when he liked, without any questions being asked, and he and Rawdon the younger many a time would walk to Gaunt Street and sit with the lady and the children there, while Sir Pitt was closeted with Rebecca, on his way to the house, or on his return from it. The ex-colonel would sit for hours in his brother's house, very silent, and thinking and doing as little as possible. He was glad to be employed of an errand, to go and make inquiries about a horse or a servant, or to carve the roast mutton for the dinner of the children. He was beat and cowed into laziness and submission. Delilah had imprisoned him and cut his hair off too. The bold and reckless young blood of 10 years back was subjugated, and was turned into a torpid, submissive, middle-aged, stout gentleman. And poor Lady Jane was aware that Rebecca had captivated her husband, although she and Mrs. Rawdon my-deared and my-loved each other every day they met. End of chapter 45.
A LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Graham Williams. Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray. Chapter 46. Struggles and Trials. Our friends at Brompton were meanwhile passing their Christmas after their fashion, and in a manner by no means too cheerful. Out of the £100 a year, which was about the amount of her income, the widow Osborne had been in the habit of giving up nearly 3/4 to her father and mother for the expenses of herself and her little boy. With £120 more supplied by Joss, this family of 4 people, attended by a single Irish servant, who also did for Clapp and his wife, might manage to live in decent comfort through the year, and hold up their heads yet, and be able to give a friend a dish of tea still, after the storms and disappointments of their early life. Sedley still maintained his ascendancy over the family of Mr. Clapp, his ex-clerk. Clapp remembered the time when, sitting on the edge of the chair, he tossed off a bumper to the health of Mrs. S., Miss Emmy, and Mr. Joseph in India, at the merchant's rich table in Russell Square. Time magnified the splendour of those recollections in the honest clerk's bosom. Whenever he came up from the kitchen parlour to the drawing-room, and partook of tea or gin and water with Mr. Sedley, he would say, "This was not what you was accustomed to once, sir," and as gravely and reverentially drink the health of the ladies as he had done in the days of their utmost prosperity. He thought Miss Melia's playing the divinest music ever performed, and her the finest lady. He never would sit down before Sedley at the club even, nor would he have that gentleman's character abused by any member of the society. He had seen the first men in London shaking hands with Mr. S. He said he'd known him in days when Rothschild might be seen on 'Change with him any day, and he owed him personally everything. Clapp, with the best of characters and handwritings, had been able very soon after his master's disaster to find other employment for himself. "Such a little fish as me can swim in any bucket," he used to remark, and a member of the house from which old Sedley had seceded was very glad to make use of Mr. Clapp's services, and to reward them with a comfortable salary. In fine, all Sedley's wealthy friends had dropped off one by one, and this poor ex-dependent still remained faithfully attached to him. Out of the small residue of her income which Amelia kept back for herself, the widow had need of all the thrift and care possible in order to enable her to keep her darling boy dressed in such a manner as became George Osborne's son, and to defray the expenses of the little school, to which, after much misgiving and reluctance, and many secret pangs and fears on her own part, she had been induced to send the lad. She had sat up of nights conning lessons and spelling over crabbed grammars and geography books, in order to teach them to Georgie. She had worked even at the Latin accidents, fondly hoping that she might be capable of instructing him in that language. To part with him all day, to send him out to the mercy of a schoolmaster's cane and his schoolfellow's roughness, was almost like weaning him over again to that weak mother, so tremulous and full of sensibility. He, for his part, rushed off to the school with the utmost happiness. He was longing for the change. That childish gladness wounded his mother, who was herself so grieved to part with him. She would rather have had him more sorry, she thought, and then was deeply repentant within herself for daring to be so selfish as to wish her own son to be unhappy. Georgie made great progress in the school, which was kept by a friend of his mother's constant admirer, the Reverend Mr. Binney. He brought home numberless prizes and testimonials of ability. He told his mother countless stories every night about his school companions, and what a fine fellow Lyons was, and what a sneak Sniffin was, and how Steele's father actually supplied the meat for the establishment, whereas Golding's mother came in a carriage to fetch him every Saturday, and how Neat had straps to his trousers. Might he have straps? And how Bull Major was so strong, though only a Eutropius, that it was believed he could lick the usher, Mr. Ward, himself. So Amelia learned to know every one of the boys in that school, as well as Georgie himself, and of nights she used to help him in his exercises, and puzzle her little head over his lessons as eagerly as if she was herself going in the morning into the presence of the master. Once, after a certain combat with Master Smith, George came home to his mother with a black eye, and bragged prodigiously to his parent and his delighted old grandfather about his valour in the fight, in which, if the truth was known, he did not behave with particular heroism, and in which he decidedly had the worst. But Amelia has never forgiven that Smith to this day, though he is now a peaceful apothecary near Leicester Square. In these quiet labours and harmless cares, the gentle widow's life was passing away, a silver hair or two marking the progress of time on her head, and a line deepening ever so little on her fair forehead. She used to smile at these marks of time. What matters it, she asked, for an old woman like me? All she hoped for was to live to see her son great, famous, and glorious, as he deserved to be. She kept his copybooks, his drawings and compositions, and showed them about in her little circle, as if they were miracles of genius. She confided some of these specimens to Miss Dobbin, to show them to Miss Osborne, George's aunt, to show them to Mr. Osborne himself, to make that old man repent of his cruelty and ill-feeling towards him who was gone. All her husband's faults and foibles she had buried in the grave with him. She only remembered the lover who had married her at all sacrifices, the noble husband, so brave and beautiful, in whose arms she had hung on the morning when he had gone away to fight and die gloriously for his king. From heaven the hero must be smiling down upon that paragon of a boy whom he had left to comfort and console her. We have seen how one of George's grandfathers, Mr. Osborne, in his easy chair in Russell Square, daily grew more violent and moody, and how his daughter, with her fine carriage and her fine horses, and her name on half the public charity lists of the town, was a lonely, miserable, persecuted old maid. She thought again and again of the beautiful little boy, her brother's son, whom she had seen. She longed to be allowed to drive in the fine carriage to the house in which he lived, and she used to look out day after day as she took her solitary drive in the park, in hopes that she might see him. Her sister, the banker's lady, occasionally condescended to pay her old home and companion a visit in Russell Square. She brought a couple of sickly children, attended by a prim nurse, and in a faint, genteel, giggling tone cackled to her sister about her fine acquaintance, and how her little Frederick was the image of Lord Claude Lollipop, and her sweet Maria had been noticed by the Baroness as they were driving in their donkey chaise at Roehampton. She urged her to make her papa do something for the darlings. Frederick, she had determined, should go into the Guards, and if they made an elder son of him, and Mr. Bullock was positively ruining and pinching himself to death to buy land, how was the darling girl to be provided for? "I expect you, dear," Mrs. Bullock would say, "for of course my share of our papa's property must go to the head of the house, you know. Dear Rhoda McMull will disengage the whole of the Castle Toddy property as soon as poor dear Lord Castle Toddy dies, who is quite epileptic, and little Macduff McMull will be Viscount Castle Toddy. Both the Mr. Bludgers of Mincing Lane have settled their fortunes on Fanny Bludgers's little boy. My darling Frederick must positively be an eldest son, and do ask papa to bring us back his account in Lombard Street, will you, dear? It doesn't look well, his going to Stumpy and Rowdy's." After which kind of speeches, in which fashion and the main chance were blended together, and after a kiss which was like the contact of an oyster, Mrs. Frederick Bullock would gather her starched nurslings and simper back into her carriage. Every visit which this leader of ton paid to her family was more unlucky for her. Her father paid more money into Stumpy and Rowdy's. Her patronage became more and more insufferable. The poor widow in the little cottage at Brompton, guarding her treasure there, little knew how eagerly some people coveted it. On that night when Jane Osborne had told her father that she had seen his grandson, the old man had made her no reply, but he had shown no anger, and had bade her good night on going himself to his room in rather a kindly voice. And he must have meditated on what she said, and have made some inquiries of the Dobbin family regarding her visit, for a fortnight after it took place he asked her where was her little French watch and chain she used to wear. "I bought it with my money, sir," she said in a great fright. "Go and order another like it, or a better if you can get it," said the old gentleman, and lapsed again into silence. Of late the Misses Dobbin more than once repeated their entreaties to Amelia to allow George to visit them. His aunt had shown her inclination. Perhaps his grandfather himself, they hinted, might be disposed to be reconciled to him. Surely Amelia could not refuse such advantageous chances for the boy. Nor could she, but she acceded to their overtures with a very heavy and suspicious heart, was always uneasy during the child's absence from her, and welcomed him back as if he was rescued out of some danger. He brought back money and toys, at which the widow looked with alarm and jealousy. She asked him always if he had seen any gentleman. "Only old Sir William, who drove him about in the four-wheeled chaise, and Mr. Dobbin, who arrived on the beautiful bay horse in the afternoon, in the green coat and pink neckcloth, with the gold-headed whip, who promised to show him the Tower of London and take him out with the Surrey hounds. At last he said, "There was an old gentleman with thick eyebrows and a broad hat and large chain and seals." He came one day as the coachman was lunging Georgie round the lawn on the grey pony. "He looked at me very much. He shook very much. I said, 'My name is Norval,' after dinner. My aunt began to cry. She's always crying." Such was George's report on that night. Then Amelia knew that the boy had seen his grandfather, and looked out feverishly for a proposal which she was sure would follow, and which came, in fact, in a few days afterwards. Mr. Osborne formally offered to take the boy, and make him heir to the fortune which he had intended that his father should inherit. He would make Mrs. George Osborne an allowance such as to assure her a decent competency. If Mrs. George Osborne proposed to marry again, as Mr. O. heard was her intention, he would not withdraw that allowance, but it must be understood that the child would live entirely with his grandfather in Russell Square, or at whatever other place Mr. O. should select, and that he would be occasionally permitted to see Mrs. George Osborne at her own residence. This message was brought or read to her in a letter one day when her mother was from home and her father absent as usual in the city. She was never seen angry but twice or thrice in her life, and it was in one of these moods that Mr. Osborne's attorney had the fortune to behold her. She rose up trembling and flushing very much as soon as, after reading the letter, Mr. Poe handed it to her, and she tore the paper into 100 fragments, which she trod on. "I marry again? I take money to part from my child? Who dares insult me by proposing such a thing? Tell Mr. Osborne it is a cowardly letter, sir, a cowardly letter. I will not answer it. I wish you good morning, sir." And she bowed me out of the room like a tragedy queen, said the lawyer who told the story. Her parents never remarked her agitation on that day, and she never told them of the interview. They had their own affairs to interest them, affairs which deeply interested this innocent and unconscious lady. The old gentleman, her father, was always dabbling in speculation. We have seen how the wine company and the coal company had failed him. But, prowling about the city always, eagerly and restlessly still, he lighted upon some other scheme, of which he thought so well that he embarked in it, in spite of the remonstrances of Mr. Clapp, to whom, indeed, he never dared to tell how far he had engaged himself in it. And as it was always Mr. Sedley's maxim not to talk about money matters before women, they had no inkling of the misfortunes that were in store for them until the unhappy old gentleman was forced to make gradual confessions. The bills of the little household, which had been settled weekly, first fell into arrear. The remittances had not arrived from India, Mr. Sedley told his wife, with a disturbed face. As she had paid her bills very regularly hitherto, one or two of the tradesmen, to whom the poor lady was obliged to go round asking for time, were very angry at a delay to which they were perfectly used from more irregular customers. Emmy's contribution, paid over cheerfully without any questions, kept the little company in half rations, however, and the first 6 months passed away pretty easily, old Sedley still keeping up with the notion that his shares must rise and that all would be well. No £60, however, came to help the household at the end of the half-year, and it fell deeper and deeper into trouble. Mrs. Sedley, who was growing infirm and was much shaken, remained silent, or wept a great deal with Mrs. Clapp in the kitchen. The butcher was particularly surly, the grocer insolent. Once or twice little Georgie had grumbled about the dinners, and Amelia, who still would have been satisfied with a slice of bread for her own dinner, could not but perceive that her son was neglected, and purchased little things out of her private purse to keep the boy in health. At last they told her such a garbled story as people in difficulties tell. One day, her own money having been received, and Amelia about to pay it over, she, who had kept an account of the moneys expended by her, proposed to keep a certain portion back out of her dividend, having contracted engagements for a new suit for Georgie. Then it came out that Joss's remittances were not paid, that the house was in difficulties which Amelia ought to have seen before, her mother said, but she cared for nothing or nobody except Georgie. At this she passed all her money across the table, without a word, to her mother, and returned to her room to cry her eyes out. She had a great access of sensibility too that day, when obliged to go and countermand the clothes, the darling clothes, on which she had set her heart for Christmas Day, and the cut and fashion of which she had arranged in many conversations with a small milliner, her friend. Hardest of all, she had to break the matter to Georgie, who made a loud outcry. Everybody had new clothes at Christmas. The others would laugh at him. He would have new clothes. She had promised them to him. The poor widow had only kisses to give him. She darned the old suits in tears. She cast about among her little ornaments to see if she could sell anything to procure the desired novelties. There was her India shawl that Dobbin had sent her. She remembered in former days going with her mother to a fine India shop on Ludgate Hill, where the ladies had all sorts of dealings and bargains in these articles. Her cheeks flushed, and her eyes shone with pleasure as she thought of this resource, and she kissed away George to school in the morning, smiling brightly after him. The boy felt that there was good news in her look. Packing up her shawl in a handkerchief, another of the gifts of the good Major, she hid them under her cloak and walked, flushed and eager, all the way to Ludgate Hill, tripping along by the park wall, and running over the crossings, so that many a man turned as she hurried by him, and looked after her rosy, pretty face. She calculated how she should spend the proceeds of her shawl, how besides the clothes she would buy the books that he longed for, and pay his half-year's schooling, and how she would buy a cloak for her father instead of that old greatcoat which he wore. She was not mistaken as to the value of the Major's gift. It was a very fine and beautiful web, and the merchant made a very good bargain when he gave her 20 guineas for her shawl. She ran on amazed and flurried with her riches to Darton's shop in St. Paul's Churchyard, and there purchased the Parents' Assistant and the Sandford and Merton Georgie longed for, and got into the coach there with her parcel and went home exulting. And she pleased herself by writing in the flyleaf in her neatest little hand, "George Osborne, a Christmas gift from his affectionate mother." The books are extant to this day, with the fair delicate superscription. She was going from her own room with the books in her hand, to place them on George's table where he might find them on his return from school, when in the passage she and her mother met. The gilt bindings of the 7 handsome little volumes caught the old lady's eye. "What are those?" she said. "Some books for Georgie," Amelia replied. I promised them to him at Christmas." "Books!" cried the elder lady indignantly. "Books, when the whole house wants bread! Books, when to keep you and your son in luxury and your dear father out of jail, I've sold every trinket I had, the India shawl from my back, even down to the very spoons, that our tradesmen mightn't insult us, and that Mr. Clapp, which indeed he is justly entitled, being not a hard landlord, and a civil man, and a father, might have his rent. Oh, Amelia, you break my heart with your books, and that boy of yours, whom you are ruining, though part with him you will not. Oh, Amelia, may God send you a more dutiful child than I have had. There's Joss deserts his father in his old age, and there's George, who might be provided for, and who might be rich, going to school like a lord, with a gold watch and chain round his neck, while my dear, dear old man is without a shilling." Hysteric sobs and cries ended Mrs. Sedley's speech. It echoed through every room in the small house, whereof the other female inmates heard every word of the colloquy. "Oh, mother, mother!" cried poor Amelia in reply. "You told me nothing. I promised him the books. I only sold my shawl this morning. Take the money, take everything." And with quivering hands she took out her silver and her sovereigns, her precious golden sovereigns, which she thrust into the hands of her mother, whence they overflowed and tumbled, rolling down the stairs. And then she went into her room and sank down in despair and utter misery. She saw it all now. Her selfishness was sacrificing the boy. But for her he might have wealth, station, education, and his father's place, which the elder George had forfeited for her sake. She had but to speak the words, and her father was restored to competency, and the boy raised to fortune. Oh, what a conviction it was to that tender and stricken heart. End of chapter 46. There's a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Graham Williams. Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray. Chapter 47. Gaunt House. All the world knows that Lord Steyne's town palace stands in Gaunt Square, out of which Great Gaunt Street leads, whither we first conducted Rebecca in the time of the departed Sir Pitt Crawley. Peering over the railings and through the black trees into the garden of the square, you see a few miserable governesses with wan-faced pupils wandering round and round it, and round the dreary grass plot in the centre of which rises the statue of Lord Gaunt who fought at Minden, in a three-tailed wig, and otherwise habited like a Roman emperor. Gaunt House occupies nearly a side of the square. The remaining three sides are composed of mansions that have passed away into dowagerism, tall dark houses with window frames of stone or picked out of a lighter red. Little light seems to be behind those lean, comfortless casements now, and hospitality to have passed away from those doors as much as the laced lackeys and link boys of old times, who used to put out their torches in the blank iron extinguishers that still flank the lamps over the steps. Brass plates have penetrated into the square. Doctors, the Middlesex Bank, Western Branch, the English and European Reunion, etc. It has a dreary look. Nor is my Lord Steyne's palace less dreary. All I have ever seen of it is the vast wall in front, with the rustic columns at the great gate, through which an old porter peers sometimes with a fat and gloomy red face, and over the wall the garret and bedroom windows, and the chimneys, out of which there seldom comes any smoke now, for the present Lord Steyne lives at Naples, preferring the view of the bay and Capri and Vesuvius to the dreary aspect of the wall in Gaunt Square. A few score yards down New Gaunt Street, and leading into Gaunt Mews indeed, is a little modest back door, which you would not remark from that of any of the other stables. But many a little close carriage has stopped at that door, as my informant, little Tom Eves, who knows everything, and who showed me the place, told me. "The Prince and Perdita have been in and out of that door, sir," he has often told me. "Marianne Clark has entered it with the Duke of... It conducts to the famous petits appartements of Lord Steyne. One, sir, fitted up all in ivory and white satin, another in ebony and black velvet. There's a little banqueting room taken from Sallust's house at Pompeii and painted by Cosway. A little private kitchen, in which every saucepan is silver and all the spits are gold. It was there that Égalité Orléans roasted partridges on the night when he and the Marquis of Steyne won 100,000 from a great personage at Ombré. Half the money went to the French Revolution, half to purchase Lord Gaunt's Marquisate and Garter, and the remainder... But it forms no part of our scheme to tell what became of the remainder, for every shilling of which, and a great deal more, little Tom Eaves, who knows everybody's affairs, is ready to account. Besides his town palace, the Marquis had castles and palaces in various quarters of the 3 kingdoms, whereof the descriptions may be found in the road books. Castle Strongbow, with its woods on the Shannon shore, Gaunt Castle in Carmarthenshire, where Richard II was taken prisoner, Gauntley Hall in Yorkshire, where I have been informed there were 200 silver teapots for the breakfasts of the guests of the house, with everything to correspond in splendour, and Stilbrook in Hampshire, which was my lord's farm, an humble place of residence, of which we all remember the wonderful furniture which was sold at my lord's demise by a late celebrated auctioneer. The Marchioness of Steyne was of the renowned and ancient family of the Carlyons, Marquesses of Camelot, who have preserved the old faith ever since the conversion of the venerable Druid, their first ancestor, and whose pedigree goes far beyond the date of the arrival of King Brute in these islands. Pendragon is the title of the eldest son of the house. The sons have been called Arthurs, Uthers, and Caradocks from immemorial time. Their heads have fallen in many a loyal conspiracy. Elizabeth chopped off the head of the Arthur of her day, who had been chamberlain to Philip and Mary, and carried letters between the Queen of Scots and her uncles the Guises. A cadet of the house was an officer of the great Duke, and distinguished in the famous St. Bartholomew conspiracy. During the whole of Mary's confinement, the house of Camelot conspired in her behalf. It was as much injured by its charges in fitting out an armament against the Spaniards during the time of the Armada, as by the fines and confiscations levied on it by Elizabeth for harbouring of priests, obstinate recusancy, and popish misdoings. A recreant of James's time was momentarily perverted from his religion by the arguments of that great theologian, and the fortunes of the family somewhat restored by his timely weakness. But the Earl of Camelot of the reign of Charles returned to the old creed of his family, and they continued to fight for it and ruin themselves for it as long as there was a Stuart left to head or to instigate a rebellion. Lady Mary Carlyon was brought up at a Parisian convent. The Dauphiness Marie-Antoinette was her godmother. In the pride of her beauty she had been married, sold, it was said, to Lord Gaunt, then at Paris, who won vast sums from the lady's brother at some of Philip of Orleans's banquets. The Earl of Gaunt's famous duel with the Count de la Marche of the Grey Musketeers was attributed by common report to the pretensions of that officer, who had been a page and remained a favourite with the Queen, to the hand of the beautiful Lady Mary Carlyon. She was married to Lord Gaunt while the Count lay ill of his wound, and came to dwell at Gaunt House and to figure for a short time in the splendid court of the Prince of Wales. Fox had toasted her. Morris and Sheridan had written songs about her. Malmesbury had made her his best bow. Walpole had pronounced her charming. Devonshire had been almost jealous of her. But she was scared by the wild pleasures and gaieties of the society into which she was flung, and after she had borne a couple of sons, shrank away into a life of devout seclusion. No wonder that my Lord Steyne, who liked pleasure and cheerfulness, was not often seen after their marriage by the side of this trembling, silent, superstitious, unhappy lady. The before-mentioned Tom Eaves, who has no part in this history except that he knew all the great folks in London and the stories and mysteries of each family, had further information regarding my Lady Steyne, which may or may not be true. The humiliations, Tom used to say, which that woman has been made to undergo in her own house have been frightful. Lord Steyne has made her sit down to table with women with whom I would rather die than allow Mrs. Eaves to associate. With Lady Crackenbury, with Mrs. Chippenham, with Madame de la Cruche-Cassay, the French secretary's wife, from every one of which ladies Tom Eaves, who would have sacrificed his wife for knowing them, was too glad to get a bow or a dinner, with the reigning favourite, in a word. And do you suppose that that woman of that family, who are as proud as the Bourbons, and to whom the Steynes are but lackeys, mushrooms of yesterday, for after all they are not of the old Gaunts, but of a minor and doubtful branch of the house, do you suppose, I say, the reader must bear in mind that it is always Tom Eaves who speaks, that the Marchioness of Steyne, the haughtiest woman in England, would bend down to her husband so submissively if there were not some cause? Pooh! I tell you there are secret reasons. I tell you that in the emigration, the Abbé de la Marche, who was here, and was employed in the Quiberon business with Puiset and Tinténiac, was the same colonel of Mousquetaires gris with whom Steyne fought in the year 86. That he and the Marchioness met again, that it was after the Reverend Colonel was shot in Brittany that Lady Steyne took to those extreme practices of devotion which she carries on now, for she is closeted with her director every day. She is at service at Spanish Place every morning. I've watched her there, that is, I've happened to be passing there, and depend on it, there's a mystery in her case. People are not so unhappy unless they have something to repent of, added Tom Eaves with a knowing wag of his head. And depend on it, that woman would not be so submissive as she is if the Marquis had not some sword to hold over her. So, if Mr. Eaves's information be correct, it is very likely that this lady, in her high stations, had to submit to many a private indignity, and to hide many secret griefs under a calm face. And let us, my brethren, who have not our names in the Red Book, console ourselves by thinking comfortably how miserable our betters may be, and that Damocles, who sits on satin cushions, and is served on gold plate, has an awful sword hanging over his head in the shape of a bailiff, or an hereditary disease, or a family secret which peeps out every now and then from the embroidered arras in a ghastly manner, and will be sure to drop one day or the other in the right place. In comparing, too, the poor man's situation with that of the great, there is always, according to Mr. Eaves, another source of comfort for the former. You, who have little or no patrimony to bequeath or to inherit, may be on good terms with your father or your son, whereas the heir of a great prince, such as my Lord Steyne, must naturally be very angry at being kept out of his kingdom, and eye the occupant of it with no very agreeable glances. Take it as a rule, this sardonic old Eaves would say, the fathers and elder sons of all great families hate each other. The crown prince is always in opposition to the crown, or hankering after it. Shakespeare knew the world, my good sir, and when he describes Prince Hal, from whose family the Gaunts pretend to be descended, though they are no more related to John of Gaunt than you are, trying on his father's coronet, he gives you a natural description of all heirs apparent. If you were heir to a dukedom and £1,000 a day, do you mean to say you would not wish for possession? Pooh! And it stands to reason that every great man, having experienced this feeling towards his father, must be aware that his son entertains it towards himself, and so they can't but be suspicious and hostile. Then again, As to the feeling of elder towards younger sons, my dear sir, you ought to know that every elder brother looks upon the cadets of the house as his natural enemies, who deprive him of so much ready money which ought to be his by right. I have often heard George McTurk, Lord Bajazet's eldest son, say that if he had his will when he came to the title, he would do what the sultans do, and clear the estate by chopping off all his younger brothers' heads at once. And so the case is, more or less, with them all. I tell you, they're all Turks in their hearts. Pooh, sir, they know the world. And here, haply, a great man coming up, Tom Eaves's hat would drop off his head, and he would rush forward with a bow and a grin, which showed that he knew the world too, in the Tom Eavesian way, that is. And having laid out every shilling of his fortune on an annuity, Tom could afford to bear no malice to his nephews and nieces, and to have no other feeling with regard to his betters, but a constant and generous desire to dine with them. Between the Marchioness and the natural and tender regard of mother for children, there was that cruel barrier placed of difference of faith. The very love which she might feel for her sons only served to render the timid and pious lady more fearful and unhappy. The gulf which separated them was fatal and impassable. She could not stretch her weak arms across it, or draw her children over to that side away from which her belief told her there was no safety. During the youth of his sons, Lord Steyne, who was a good scholar and amateur casuist, had no better sport in the evening after dinner in the country than in setting the boy's tutor, the Reverend Mr. Trail, now my Lord Bishop of Ealing, on her ladyship's director, Father Mole, over their wine, and in pitting Oxford against St. Achot. He cried, "Bravo, Latimer!" "Well said, Loyola!" alternately. He promised Mole a bishopric if he would come over, and vowed he would use all his influence to get Trail a cardinal's hat if he would secede. Neither divine allowed himself to be conquered, and though the fond mother hoped that her youngest and favourite son would be reconciled to her church, his mother church, a sad and awful disappointment awaited the devout lady, a disappointment which seemed to be a judgment upon her for the sin of her marriage. My Lord Gaunt married, as every person who frequents the peerage knows, the Lady Blanche Thistlewood, a daughter of the noble house of Bareacres, before mentioned in this veracious history. A wing of Gaunt House was assigned to this couple, for the head of the family chose to govern it, and while he reigned, to reign supreme. His son and heir, however, living little at home, disagreeing with his wife, and borrowing upon post-obits such moneys as he required beyond the very moderate sums which his father was disposed to allow him. The Marquis knew every shilling of his son's debts. At his lamented demise he was found himself to be the possessor of many of his heir's bonds, purchased for their benefit, and devised by his lordship to the children of his younger son. As, to my Lord Gaunt's dismay and the chuckling delight of his natural enemy and father, the Lady Gaunt had no children, the Lord George Gaunt was desired to return from Vienna, where he was engaged in waltzing and diplomacy, and to contract a matrimonial alliance with the Honourable Joan, only daughter of John Jones, 1st Baron Helvellyn, the head of the firm of Jones, Brown, and Robinson of Threadneedle Street, bankers, from which union sprang several sons and daughters whose doings do not appertain to this story. The marriage at first was a happy and prosperous one. My Lord George Gaunt could not only read, but write pretty correctly. He spoke French with considerable fluency, and was one of the finest waltzers in Europe. With these talents and his interest at home, there was little doubt that his lordship would rise to the highest dignities in his profession. The lady his wife felt that courts were her sphere, and her wealth enabled her to receive splendidly in those continental towns whither her husband's diplomatic duties led him. There was talk of appointing him minister, and bets were laid at the travellers that he would be ambassador ere long, when of a sudden rumours arrived of the secretary's extraordinary behaviour. At a grand diplomatic dinner given by his chief, he had started up and declared that a pâté de foie gras was poisoned. He went to a ball at the hotel of the Bavarian envoy, the Count de Springbok-Hohenlaufen, with his head shaved and dressed as a Capuchin friar. It was not a masked ball, as some folks wanted to persuade you. It was something queer, people whispered. His grandfather was so. It was in the family. His wife and family returned to this country and took up their abode at Gaunt House. Lord George gave up his post on the European continent and was gazetted to Brazil. But people knew better. He never returned from that Brazil expedition, never died there, never lived there, never was there at all. He was nowhere. He was gone out altogether. "Brazil," said one gossip to another with a grin. "Brazil is St. John's Wood. Rio Janeiro's a cottage surrounded by four walls. George Gaunt's accredited to a keeper, who has invested him with the order of the strait waistcoat." These are the kinds of epitaphs which men pass over one another in Vanity Fair. Twice or thrice in a week, in the earliest morning, the poor mother went for her sins and saw the poor invalid. Sometimes he laughed at her, and his laughter was more pitiful than to hear him cry. Sometimes she found the brilliant, dandy diplomatist of the Congress of Vienna dragging about a child's toy, or nursing the keeper's baby's doll. Sometimes he knew her and Father Mole, her director and companion. Oftener he forgot her, as he had done wife, children, love, ambition, vanity. But he remembered his dinner hour, and used to cry if his wine and water was not strong enough. It was the mysterious taint of the blood. The poor mother had brought it from her own ancient race. The evil had broken out once or twice in the father's family, long before Lady Steyne's sins had begun, or her fasts and tears and penances had been offered in their expiation. The pride of the race was struck down as the firstborn of Pharaoh. The dark mark of fate and doom was on the threshold, the tall old threshold, surmounted by coronets and carved heraldry. The absent lord's children, meanwhile, prattled and grew on, quite unconscious that the doom was over them too. First they talked of their father, and devised plans against his return. Then the name of the living dead man was less frequently in their mouth, then not mentioned at all. But the stricken old grandmother trembled to think that these too were the inheritors of their father's shame as well as of his honours, and watched sickening for the day when the awful ancestral curse should come down on them. This dark presentiment also haunted Lord Steyne. He tried to lay the horrid bedside ghost in red seas of wine and jollity, and lost sight of it sometimes in the crowd and rout of his pleasures, but it always came back to him when alone, and seemed to grow more threatening with years. "I've taken your son," it said. "Why not you? I may shut you up in a prison some day, like your son, George. I may tap you on the head tomorrow. And away go pleasure and honours, feasts and beauty, friends, flatterers, French cooks, fine horses and houses, in exchange for a prison. a keeper, and a straw mattress like George Gaunt's. And then my lord would defy the ghost which threatened him, for he knew of a remedy by which he could balk his enemy. So there was splendour and wealth, but no great happiness, perchance, behind the tall carved portals of Gaunt House, with its smoky coronets and ciphers. The feasts there were of the grandest in London, but there was not overmuch content therewith, except among the guests who sat at my lord's table. Had he not been so great a prince, very few possibly would have visited him, but in Vanity Fair the sins of very great personages are looked at indulgently. Nous regardons à deux fois, as the French lady said, before we condemn a person of my lord's undoubted quality. Some notorious carpers and squeamish moralists might be sulky with Lord Steyne, but they were glad enough to come when he asked them. "Lord Steyne is really too bad," Lady Slingstone said, "but everybody goes, and of course I shall see that my girls come to no harm." "His lordship is a man to whom I owe much, everything in life," said the Right Reverend Dr. Trail, thinking that the Archbishop was rather shaky, and Mrs. Trail and the young ladies would as soon have missed going to church as to one of his lordship's parties. "His morals are bad," said little Lord Southdown to his sister, who meekly expostulated, having heard terrific legends from her mamma with respect to the doings at Gaunt House. "But hang it, he's got the best dry sillery in Europe." And as for Sir Pitt Crawley, Baronet, Sir Pitt, that pattern of decorum, Sir Pitt, who had led off at missionary meetings, he never for one moment thought of not going too. "Where you see such persons as the Bishop of Ealing and the Countess of Slingstone, you may be pretty sure, Jane," the Baronet would say, "that we cannot be wrong. The great rank and station of Lord Steyne put him in a position to command people in our station of life. The Lord Lieutenant of a county, my dear, is a respectable man. Besides, George Gaunt and I were intimate in early life. He was my junior when we were attachés at Pumpernickel together. In a word, everybody went to wait upon this great man, everybody who was asked. As you, the reader, do not say nay, or I, the writer hereof, would go if we had an invitation." End of chapter 47.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dexnell Peters. Vanity Fair by William Thackeray. Chapter 48, in which the reader is introduced to the very best of company. At last, Becky's kindness and attention to the chief of her husband's family were destined to meet with an exceeding great reward, a reward which, though certainly somewhat unsubstantial, the little woman coveted with greater eagerness than more positive benefits. If she did not wish to lead a virtuous life, at least she desired to enjoy a character for virtue, and we know that no lady in the gentle world can possess this desideratum until she is put on a train and feathers and has been presented to her sovereign at court. From that august interview they come out stamped as honest women. The Lord Chamberlain gives them a certificate of virtue, and as dubious goods or letters are passed through an oven at Quarantine, sprinkled with aromatic vinegar, and then pronounced clean, many a lady whose reputation would be doubtful otherwise, and liable to give infection, passes through the wholesome ordeal of the royal presence, and issues from it free from all taint. It might be very well for my Lady Bearcross, my Lady Tufto, Mrs. Bute Crawley in the country, and other ladies who had come into contact with Mrs. Rawdon Crawley, to cry fie at the idea of the odious little adventuress making her curtsy before the sovereign, and to declare that, if dear good Queen Charlotte had been alive, she never would have admitted such an extremely ill-regulated personage into her chaste drawing-room. But when we consider that it was the first gentleman in Europe in whose high presence Mrs. Rawdon passed her examination, and as it were took her degree in reputation, it surely must be flat disloyalty to doubt any more about her virtue. I, for my part, look back with love and awe to that great character in history. Ah, what a high and noble appreciation of gentle womanhood there must have been in Vanity Fair, when that revered and august being was invested, by the universal acclaim of the refined and educated portion of this empire, with the title of Premier Gentlewoman of this kingdom. Do you remember there, O friend of my youth, how one blissful night 25 years ago, the hypocrite being acted, Elliston being manager, Doughton and Liston performers, two boys had leave from their loyal masters to go out from Slaughterhouse School, where they were educated, and to appear on Drury Lane stage amongst a crowd which assembled there to greet the king. The king! There he was. Beefeaters were before the august box. The Marquis of Steyne, Lord of the Powder Closet, and other great officers of state were behind the chair on which he sat. He sat, florid of face, portly of person, covered with orders, and in a rich curling head of hair. How we sang God Save Him! How the house rocked and shouted with that magnificent music! How they cheered and cried, and waved handkerchiefs! Ladies wept, mothers clasped their children, some fainted with emotion. People were suffocated in the pit, shrieks and groans rising up amidst the writing and shouting mass there of his people, who were, and indeed showed themselves almost to be ready to die for him. Yes, we saw him. Fate cannot deprive us of that. Others have seen Napoleon. Some few still exist who have beheld Frederick the Great, Dr. Johnson, Marie Antoinette, and etc. Be it our reasonable boast to our children that we saw George the Good, the Magnificent, the Great. Well, there came a happy day in Mrs. Rawdon Crawley's existence, when this angel was admitted into the paradise of a court which she coveted, her sister-in-law acting as her godmother. On the appointed day, Sir Pitt and his lady, in their great family carriage, just newly built, and ready for the baronet's assumption of the office of High Sheriff of his county, drove up to the little house in Curzon Street, to the edification of Raggles, who was watching from his greengrocer's shop, and saw fine plumes within, and enormous bunches of flowers in the breast of the new livery coats of the footmen. Sir Pitt, in a glittering uniform, descended and went into Curzon Street, his sword between his legs. Little Rawdon stood with his face against the parlour window-panes, smiling and nodding with all his might to his aunt in the carriage within, and presently Sir Pitt issued forth from the house again, leading forth a lady with grand feathers, covered in a white shawl, and holding up daintily a train of magnificent brocade. She stepped into the vehicle as if she were a princess and accustomed all her life to go to court, smiling graciously on the footman at the door and on Sir Pitt, who followed her into the carriage. Then Rawdon followed in his old guard's uniform, which had grown woefully shabby and was much too tight. He was to have followed the procession and waited upon his sovereign in a cab, but that his good-natured sister-in-law insisted that they should be a family party. The coach was large, the ladies not very big. They would hold their trains in their laps. Finally, the four went fraternally together, and their carriage presently joined the line of royal equipages, which was making its way down Piccadilly and St. James's Street, towards the old brick palace where the Star of Brunswick was in waiting to receive his nobles and gentlefolks. Becky felt as if she could bless the people out of the carriage windows. So elated was she in spirit, and so strong a sense had she of the dignified position which she had at last attained in life. Even our Becky had her weaknesses, and as one often sees how men pride themselves upon excellences which others are slow to perceive, how, for instance, Comus firmly believes that he is the greatest tragic actor in England, how Brown, the famous novelist, longs to be considered not a man of genius, but a man of fashion, while Robinson, the great lawyer, does not in the least care about his reputation in Westminster Hall, but believes himself incomparable across country, and at a 5-barred gate. So to be, and to be thought a respectable woman, was Becky's aim in life, and she got up the genteel with amazing assiduity, readiness, and success. We have said there were times when she believed herself to be a fine lady, and forgot that there was no money in the chest at home. Duns round the gate, tradesmen to coax and wheedle, no ground to work upon, in a word. And as she went to court in the carriage, the family carriage, she adopted a demeanour so grand, self-satisfied, deliberate, and imposing, that it made even Lady Jane laugh. She walked into the royal apartments with a toss of her head which would have befitted an empress, and I have no doubt had she been one, she would have become the character perfectly. We are authorized to state that Mrs. Rawdon Crawley's costume de cas on the occasion of her presentation to the sovereign was of the most elegant and brilliant description. Some ladies we may have seen, we who wear stars and cordons and attend the St. James assemblies, or we who in muddy boots dawdle up and down Pall Mall and peep into the coaches as they drive up with the great folks in their feathers, some ladies of fashion, I say, we may have seen about 2 o'clock of the forenoon of a levee day, as the laced jacketed band of the Life Guards are blowing triumphal marches, seated on those prancing music stools, their cream-coloured chargers, who are by no means lovely and enticing objects at early period of noon. A stout countess of 60, décolletée, painted, wrinkled with rouge up to her drooping eyelids, and diamonds twinkling in her wig, is a wholesome and edifying, but not a pleasant sight. She has the faded look of a St. James Street illumination, as it may be seen of an early morning, when half the lamps are out and the others are blinking wanly, as if they were about to vanish like ghosts before the dawn. Such charms are those of which we catch glimpses while her ladyship's carriage passes, should appear broad at night alone. If even Cynthia looks haggard of an afternoon, as we may see her sometimes in the present winter season, with Phoebus staring her out of countenance from the opposite side of the heavens, how much more can old Lady Castlemouldy keep her head up when the sun is shining full upon it through the chariot windows, and showing all the chinks and crannies with which time has marked her face? No, drawing-rooms should be announced for November, or the first foggy day, or the elderly sultanas of our Vanity Fair should drive up in closed litters, descend in a covered way, and make their curtsy to the sovereign under the protection of lamp-light. Our beloved Rebecca had no need, however, of any such a friendly halo to set off her beauty. Her complexion could bear any sunshine as yet, and her dress, though if you were to see it now, any present lady of Vanity Fair would pronounce it to be the most foolish and preposterous attire ever worn, was as handsome in her eyes and those of the public, some 25 years since, as the most brilliant costume of the most famous beauty of the present season. A score of years hence that too that milliners' wonder will have passed into the domain of the absurd, along with all previous vanities. But we are wondering too much. Mrs. Rawdon's dress was pronounced to be charmante on the eventful day of her presentation. Even good Lady Jane was forced to acknowledge this effect, as she looked at her kinswoman and owned sorrowfully to herself that she was quite inferior in taste to Mrs. Becky. She did not know how much care, thought, and genius Mrs. Rawdon had bestowed upon that garment. Rebecca had as good taste as any milliner in Europe, and such a clever way of doing things as Lady Jane little understood. The latter quickly spied out the magnificence of the brocade of Becky's train and the splendor of the lace on her dress. The brocade was an old remnant, Becky said, and as for the lace, it was a great bargain. She had had it these 100 years. "My dear Mrs. Crawley, it must have been a cost of a little fortune," Lady Jane said, looking down at her own lace, which was not nearly so good, and then examining the quality of the ancient brocade which formed the material of Mrs. Rawdon's court dress. She felt inclined to say that she could not afford such a fine clothing, but checked that speech with an effort as one uncharitable to her kinswoman. And yet, if Lady Jane had known all, I think even her kindly temper would have failed her. The fact is, when she was putting Sir Pitt's house in order, Mrs. Rawdon had found the lace and the brocade in the old wardrobes, the property of the former ladies of the house, and had quietly carried the goods home, and had stuff suited them to her own little person. Briggs saw her take them, asked no question, told no stories, but I believe quite sympathized with her on this matter, and so with many another honest woman. "And the diamonds. Where the deuce did you get the diamonds, Becky?" said her husband, admiring some jewels which he had never seen before, and which sparkled in her ears and on her neck with brilliance and profusion. Becky blushed a little, and looked at him hard for a moment. Pitt Crawley blushed a little too, and looked out of window. The fact is, he had given her a very small portion of the brilliants, a pretty diamond clasp which confined a pearl necklace which she wore, and the baronet had omitted to mention the circumstance to his lady. Becky looked at her husband and then at Sir Pitt with an air of saucy triumph, as much as to say, "Shall I betray you?" "Guess," she said to her husband. "Why, you silly man," she continued, "where do you suppose I got them? All except the little clasp, which a dear friend of mine gave me long ago. I hired them, to be sure. I hired them at Mr. Polonius in Coventry Street. You don't suppose that all the diamonds which go to court belong to the wearers, like those beautiful stones which Lady Jane has, and which are much handsomer than any which I have, I am certain." "They are family jewels," said Sir Pitt, again looking uneasy, and in this family conversation the carriage rolled down the street until its cargo was finally discharged at the gates of the palace where the sovereign was sitting in state. The diamonds which had created Rawdon's admiration never went back to Mr. Polonius of Coventry Street, and that gentleman never applied for their restoration, but they retired into a little private repository in an old desk, which Amelia Sedley had given her years and years ago, and in which Becky kept a number of useful and perhaps valuable things, about which her husband knew nothing. To know nothing, or little, is in the nature of some husbands. To hide in the nature of how many women. O ladies, how many of you have surreptitious milliners' bills? How many of you have gowns and bracelets which you daren't show, which you wear trembling and coaxing with smiles the husband by your side, who does not know the new velvet gown from the old one, or the new bracelet from last year's, or has any notion that the ragged-looking yellow lace scarf cost 40 guineas, and that Madame Bourbonnot is writing Donny letters every week for the money? Thus Rawdon knew nothing about the brilliant diamond earrings, or the superb brilliant ornament which decorated the fair bosom of his lady, but Lord Steyne, who was in his place at court as Lord of the Powder Closet, and one of the great dignitaries and illustrious defences of the throne of England, and came up with all his stars, garters, colours, and cordons, and paid particular attention to the little woman, knew whence the jewels came and who paid for them. As he bowed over her he smiled, and quoted the hackneyed and the beautiful lines from the Rape of the Lock about Belinda's diamonds, which Jews might kiss and infidels adore. "But I hope your lordship is orthodox," said the little lady with a toss of her head, and many ladies round about whispered and talked, and many gentlemen nodded and whispered, as they saw what marked attention the great nobleman was paying to the little adventuress. What were the circumstances of the interview between Rebecca Crawley, knee-sharp, and her imperial master, it does not become such a feeble and inexperienced pen as mine to attempt to relate. The dazzled eyes closed before that magnificent idea. Loyal respect and decency tell even the imagination not to look too keenly and audaciously about the sacred audience chamber, but to back away rapidly, silently, and respectfully, making profound bows out of the august presence. This may be said, that in all London there was no more loyal heart than Becky's after this interview. The name of a king was always on her lips, and he was proclaimed by her to be the most charming of men. She went to Coligny's and ordered the finest portrait of him that art had produced and credit could supply. She chose that famous one in which the best of monarchs is represented in a frock coat and a fur collar, and breeches and silk stockings, simpering on a sofa from under his curly brown wig. She had it painted in a brooch and wore it. Indeed, she amused and somewhat pestered her acquaintance with a perpetual talk about his urbanity and beauty. Who knows? Perhaps the little woman thought she might play the part of a Maintenon or a Pompadour. But the finest sport of all after her presentation was to hear her talk virtuously. She had a few female acquaintances, not, it must be owned, of the very highest reputation in Vanity Fair, but being made an honest woman of, so to speak, Becky would not consort any longer with these dubious ones, and cut Lady Crackenbury when the latter nodded to her from her opera box, and gave Mrs. Washington White the go-by in the ring. "One must, my dear, show one is somebody," she said. "One mustn't be seen with doubtful people. Pity Lady Crackenbury from her heart, and from Mrs. Washington White may be a very good-natured person. You may go and dine with them as you're like your rubber, but I mustn't and won't, and you will have the goodness to tell Smith to say I am not at home when either of them calls." The particulars of Becky's costume were in the newspapers. Feathers, lappets, superb diamonds, and all the rest. Lady Crackenbury read the paragraph in bitterness of spirit and discoursed to her followers about the airs which the woman was giving herself. Mrs. Bute Crawley and her young ladies in the country had a copy of the Morning Post from town, and gave a vent to their honest indignation. "If you had been sandy-haired, green-eyed, and a French rope dancer's daughter," Mrs. Bute said to her eldest girl, who on the contrary was a very swarthy, short, and stub-nosed young lady, "you might have had superb diamonds forsooth, and have been presented at court by your cousin, the Lady Jane. But you're only a gentlewoman, my dear child, my poor dear child. You have only some of the best blood in England in your veins, and good principles and piety for your portion. I myself, the wife of a baronet's younger brother, too, never thought of such a thing as going to court, nor with other people. If good Queen Charlotte had been alive, in this way the worthy rectoress consoled herself, and her daughter sighed and sat over the peerage all night." A few days after the famous presentation, another great and exceeding honour was vouchsafed to the virtuous Becky. Lady Steyne's carriage drove up to Mr. Rawdon Crawley's door, and the footman, instead of driving down the front of the house, as by his tremendous knocking he appeared to be inclined to do, relented, and only delivered in a couple of cards, on which were engraven the names of the Marchioness of Steyne and the Countess of Gaunt. If these bits of pasteboard had been beautiful pictures, or had had 100 yards of Malines lace rolled around them, worth twice the number of guineas, Becky could not have regarded them with more pleasure. You may be sure they occupied a conspicuous place in the china bowl on the drawing-room table, where Becky kept the cards of her visitors. Lord, oh Lord, how poor Mrs. Washington White's card, and Lady Crackenbury's card, which our little friend had been glad enough to get a few months back, and of which the silly little creature was rather proud once. Lord, Lord, I say, how soon at the appearance of these grand court cards did those poor little neglected deuces sink down to the bottom of the pack. Stein, Berkelers, Johns of Helvellyn, and Caroline of Camelot. We may be sure that Becky and Briggs looked out those august names in the peerage, and followed the noble races up through all the ramifications of the family tree. My Lord Stein, coming to call a couple of hours afterwards, and looking about him and observing everything as was his wont, found his lady's cards already ranged as the trumps of Becky's hands, and grinned as this old cynic always did at any naive display of human weakness. Becky came down to him presently. Whenever the dear girl expected his lordship, a toilette was prepared, her hair in perfect order, her mouchoirs, aprons, shafts, little morocco slippers, and other female gimcracks arranged, and she seated in some artless and agreeable posture, ready to receive him whenever she was surprised. Of course, she had to fly to her apartment to take a rapid survey of matters in the glass, and to trip down again to wait upon the great peer. She found him grinning over the bowl. She was discovered, and she blushed a little. "Thank you, Monseigneur," she said. "You see your ladies have been here. How good of you. I couldn't come before. I was in the kitchen making a pudding." "I know you were. I saw you through the area railings as I drove up," replied the old gentleman. "You see everything." "A few things, but not that, my pretty lady," he said good-natured. "You silly little fibster. I heard you in the room overhead, where I have no doubt you were putting a little rouge on. You must give some of yours to my Lady Gaunt, whose complexion is quite preposterous, and I heard the bedroom door open, and then you came downstairs." "Is it a crime to try and look my best when you come here?" answered Mrs. Rawdon plaintively, and she rubbed her cheek with a handkerchief, as if to show there was no rouge at all, only genuine blushes and modesty in her case. About this, who can tell? I know there is some rouge that won't come off on a pocket handkerchief, and some so good that even tears will not disturb it. "Well," said the old gentleman, twiddling round his wife's card, "you are bent on becoming a fine lady. You pester my poor old life, but to get you into the world you won't be able to hold your own there, you silly little fool. You've got no money." "You will get us a place," interposed Becky, "as quick as possible." "You've got no money, and you want to compete with those who have. You poor little earthenware pipkin. You want to swim down the stream along with the great copper kettles. All women are alike. Everybody is striving for what is not worth the having. Gad! Dined with the king yesterday, and we had neck of mutton and turnips. A dinner of herbs is better than a stalled ox very often. You will go to Gaunt House. You give an old fellow no rest until you get there. It's not half so nice as here. You'll be bored there. I am. My wife is as gay as Lady Macbeth, and my daughter's as cheerful as Regan and Goneril. I daren't sleep in what they call my bedroom. The bed is like the baldaquin of St. Peter's, and the pictures frighten me. I have a little brass bed in a dressing-room, and a little hair mattress like an anchorite. I am an anchorite. Ah, ho, ho! You'll be asked to dinner next week. And gare or femme, look out and hold your own. All the women will bully you. This was a very long speech for a man of few words like my Lord Stein. Nor was it the first which he uttered for Becky's benefit on that day. Briggs looked up from the work-table at which she was seated in the farther room, and gave a deep sigh as she heard the great Marquis speak so lightly for her sex. "If you don't turn off that abominable sheep-dog," said Lord Stein, with a savage look over his shoulder at her, "I will have her poisoned." "I always give my dog dinner from my own plate," said Rebecca, laughing mischievously, and having enjoyed for some time the discomfiture of my lord, who hated poor Briggs for interrupting his tete-a-tete with the fair consul's wife. Mrs. Rawdon at length had pity upon her admirer, and calling to Briggs, praised the fineness of the weather to her, and bade her to take out that child for a walk. "I can't send her away," Becky said presently, after a pause, and in a very sad voice. Her eyes filled with tears as she spoke, and she turned away her head. "You owe her her wages, I suppose," said the pair. "Worse than that," said Becky, still casting down her eyes. "I have ruined her." "Ruined her? Then why don't you turn her out?" the gentleman asked. "Men do that," Becky answered bitterly. "Women are not so bad as you. Last year, when you were reduced to our last guinea, she gave us everything. She shall never leave me until we are ruined utterly ourselves, which does not seem far off, or until I can pay her the utmost farthing." "How much is it?" said the peer with an oath, and Becky, reflecting on the largeness of his means, mentioned not only the sum which he had borrowed from Miss Briggs, but one of nearly double the amount. This caused the Lord Steyne to break out in another brief and energetic expression of anger, at which Rebecca held down her head the more and cried bitterly. "I could not help it. It was my only chance. I dare not tell my husband. He would kill me if I told him what I have done. I have kept it a secret from everybody but you, and you forced it from me. Ah, what shall I do, Lord Steyne? For I am very, very unhappy." Lord Steyne made no reply except by beating the devil's tattoo and biting his nails. At last he clapped his hat on his head and flung out of the room. Rebecca did not rise from her attitude of misery until the door slammed upon him and his carriage whirled away. Then she rose up with the queerest expression of victorious mischief glittering in her green eyes. She burst out laughing once or twice to herself. As she sat at work, and sitting down to the piano, she rattled away a triumphant voluntary on the keys, which made the people pause under her window to listen to her brilliant music. That night there came 2 notes from Gaunt House for the little woman. The one containing a card of invitation from Lord and Lady Steyne to a dinner at Gaunt House next Friday, while the other enclosed a slip of grey paper bearing Lord Steyne's signature and the address of Messrs. Jones, Browns and Robinson, Lombard Street. Rawdon heard Becky laughing in the night once or twice. It was only her delight at going to Gaunt House and facing the ladies there, she said, which amused her, sir, but the truth was that she was occupied with a great number of other thoughts. Should she pay off old Briggs and give her her conge? Should she astonish Raggles by settling his account? She turned over all these thoughts on her pillow, and on the next day, when Rawdon went out to pay his morning visit to the club, Mrs. Crawley, in a modest dress with a veil on, whipped off in a hackney coach to the city, and being landed at Messrs. Jones and Robinson's bank, presented a document there to the authority at the desk, who in reply asked her how she would take it. She gently said she would take £150 in small notes, and the remainder in 1 note, and passing through St. Paul's churchyard, stopped there and bought the handsomest black silk gown for Briggs which money could buy, and which, with a kiss and the kindest speeches, she presented to the little old spinster. Then she walked to Mr. Raggles, inquired about his children affectionately, and gave him £50 on account. Then she went to the liveryman, from whom she jobbed her carriages, and gratified him with a similar sum. "And I hope this will be a lesson to you, Spavin," she said, "and that on the next drawing-room day my brother, Sir Pitt, will not be inconvenienced by being obliged to take 4 of us in his carriage, to wait upon his Majesty, because my own carriage is not forthcoming." It appears there had been a difference on the last drawing-room day, hence the degradation which the colonel had almost suffered, of being obliged to enter the presence of his sovereign in a hack cab. These arrangements concluded, Becky paid a visit upstairs to the before-mentioned desk, which Amelia Sedley had given her years and years ago, and which contained a number of useful and valuable little things, in which private museum she placed the 1 note which Messrs. Jones and Robinson's cashier had given her. End of chapter 48.